Welcome back, everyone. Let's continue with session 5, which is considering future generations. We've already, the last presentation has already touched on this point. So now this is session 5, considering future generations. And I would like to remind everyone that we have 15 minutes per speaker, and that afterwards, after the 4 speakers, we have a general discussion. And if it's possible at all, it would be great if speakers could spare some time of their 15 minutes for direct questions. I'm aware that the 50 is short, but yeah, if it's possible, this would be great. If not, we discuss afterwards. So let's begin with our first speaker. It's Josep Recasens-Subias from the University of Barcelona. Josep, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
The title of his presentation is there an ethical right of having children in front of the ecological crisis? A critique of the ethical right to one child. So go ahead, it's your turn now.
Yeah, can I share screen?
Yeah, sure.
Perfect. Perfect. Do you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm Josep Recasens, and I will give my presentation about if there is an ethical right of having children in front of the ecological crisis, and I will present as well a critique of the ethical right to one child. Yeah, just to begin with some context, during the last years, questions such as what responsibilities do we have towards future generations have been gaining importance in the political philosophy debates. Questions, this is obviously true because of all the new data we have about climate change. And other questions start to begin to be important, so such as how many resources should we leave the future generations. And this is obviously because we are conscious that there is a risk of overpopulation, and overpopulation has been a problem before, where different states have treated this in different ways. For example, China. But I want to focus on the ethical responsibility and the individual responsibility of if we should have children in front of the ecological crisis. Maybe you could worry about what has to do having children with the ecological crisis, but having children is one of the activities that pollutes the most compared with other activities such having a car or traveling by plane. And considering that the world population is going to increase, maybe we should ask ourselves if having children pollutes that much, if we really have a right to have children in this situation. So in this presentation, I want to defend 2 ideas. The first is that yes, it is ethically permissible to have children in the face of the ecological crisis. And second, I will defend is that if there is a moral limit to this number of children that one can have, it must be the number of children necessary to fulfill the conception of a good life, that obviously this varies according to each person. I will try to explain this later. So I structured this brief talk into 3 parts. The first, I will present the ethical right to one child. In the second place, I will critique this position. And finally, I will propose my new moral limit. The ethical right to one child begins with the idea that there is no right to have unlimited children. There are different justifications of this idea, but what I don't want to comment now, we could comment it later. But I think that the intuition is true. I mean, in the case of overpopulation, we should not have unlimited children. But this leaves us in front. That leaves us 2 options. The first one is that we could consider that having children is always a mere preference, not a right, such as young. And this will mean that in case of necessity, we should limit ourselves we should not have children. But another option is to defend that there is a right to have children, but that it must be limited in a non-arbitrary way. Well, the right to one child position defends that there is a right to have children, and gives 3 reasons why there should be a right that I found. The first reason they defend is that having descendants is important for some people to have a meaningful life, as Conley says. The second reason could be that some persons need to develop certain skills and achieve some important goods that are related to being a parent that cannot be achieved in any other way. And also for some people, having a family is something important for their life. So the right to one child, what they defend, what the advocates of this position defend, is that with one child, accessing, that means when you access into parenthood, all these 3 reasons can be fulfilled. And therefore, there are needed other reasons to justify a right to have a second child. For this position, having one child is a right, but the second is a preference. And this could be easily seen with the example of a house, where we all think that you have a right to have a house to have a good life, but we all consider that having a second house is something more related to a luxury or to these kind of things, and not to a necessity, and therefore not a right. Meyers summarizes this position, saying that the right to have a child is conditional. That means since it brings access to parenthood, and also limited if it's only one child. Nonetheless, I want to criticize to this position that I think they have a conception of parenthood or being a parent that is in some sense counterintuitive. What they try to justify is that having one child obviously makes a substantive difference for a parent because brings you the property of parenthood. But what they defend is that the second child does not modify in a substantial way this property, and therefore your condition of parent is the same. But what I want to defend is that there is a more intuitive way of thinking of the relationship of being a parent, and it is that we should think of it as being a parent of X, where X isn't a specific individual. What I try to express with this idea is that having children is more similar to having friends than having houses. With one friend, it is obviously that you will develop and gain all the advantages of friendship, but we don't consider that having a second friend is something less important or less essential for your conception of friendship. I mean, with a new friend, you can develop new abilities or skills, and you can achieve new goods that are important and are difficult to compare. So therefore, what I define is that every new child brings a qualitative difference to the property of being a parent. What I do now, what I do in my article, is to reconsider the 3 reasons that justify it having a right to one child, and I try to consider if they could be used to justify a right to have more than one child. I don't have here to treat the 3 of them, but I'm going to focus on the most important one. I think that it was that having one child already enables you to develop the skills and achieve the goods related to being a parent. Some examples of these skills or goods are, for example, a parent-child love or an intimate sphere. Well, returning to the example of friendship, it is difficult to say that with one friend we could develop all the skills and achieve all the goods that we want to develop or achieve. And therefore, it is difficult to say that we could, with one only child, we could also develop all the skills and achieve all the goods we want to achieve as a parent. In fact, every new child, since has a different personality and different needs, implies for you as a parent different skills, different skills, but at the same time, the same skills realized in a different way. For example, if you have a child, if you have to different children may need the same skill in a different way. For example, if you as a parent need to take care of 2 children, taking care for one may imply to be there when they need it. They may need physical contact, but in another context may need another child may need to to be alone and to have no interaction. So therefore, what I think is that if this reason is strong enough to justify a right to have one child, but for you as a parent with one child cannot be satisfied, there should be a right to have more children. Just to recap a bit, the right to one child position defended that with one child, the three elements to have a good life are satisfied. I argue that this idea is based on a conception of the property of parenthood that is mistaken, because every new child implies a qualitative leap, and the three elements may not be satisfied with an only child. And therefore, the reasons that justify the right to have one child also can justify a right to have more if they are necessary for certain conceptions of a good life. And this brings to my proposal of a new moral limit, that because I think that there is an incorrect conclusion that is to defend that there is not a right to have children. But in fact, I think that the logical conclusion should be that there is a right to have children. And if there is a numerical limit, it has to be the number of children necessary to fulfill the conception of a good life of each individual. That means to have the children that enables you to develop and achieve all the abilities and goods that you want. There is just a small problem with this limit that is, it seems that a bit weird because it's different from person to person, and it's different for the same person at different moments. But I argue that I make what I try to I think that it could be better understood with another example of another moral limit. So in a situation of overpopulation, we may think that there is the moral limit to not consume more calories than the necessary. And this obviously will imply a different number of calories from person to person, but also a different number of calories for the same person at different moments of their life. Well, in conclusion, the right to one child position is based on a mistaken conception of being a parent. Remember the example of a house, and one is always a parent of X, being X a specific individual. It's more clear with the example of a friend. The same reasons that justify a right to one child can be used to justify having more if they are necessary to fulfill the conception of a good life of a certain individual. And there may be other moral reasons to justify an ethical limitation of the number of children that I don't have time to consider. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to hear your questions.
Thank you, Joseph, for this clear presentation. So we have time for questions, which is fantastic. So type your questions in the chat or raise your hand. Natasha?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just clapping.
Oh, you were just clapping.
Yes.
Oh, it's difficult to see sometimes. Okay. Yeah, but Peter has a question, isn't it?
Yes. Towards the ending of you trying to wrap up your presentation, I was just having a thought in my head, and it just made me laugh. I was like, well, I'm going to go into that, but I want to thank you first of all for the presentation. It's awesome. The topic is interesting. Imagine this. Imagine a world for the next 30 years on planet Earth, where all the families on the earth is meant to have just one child for the next 30 years. What could be the tangible impact that will have on climate change in terms of the population, in terms of how people relate with the climate? Do you see any light into my question? I don't know.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you very well. What are you trying to say is that what will be the difference if in 80 years there is less population, or people just want to have one child?
Yes.
Well, obviously, in 10 minutes, I don't have time to consider all this topic in deep, but obviously all the population, the pollution of one life changes according to the country and the way of living, and therefore it would also depend on a lot of different factors. But if there is a future where with the lifestyle of the rich countries, there will be obviously it will be easier if people has only one child than if there are two or more. I don't know if I can answer you.
Claudio had a question. He writes, how does adoption fit within your argument?
Yeah, in this sense, I consider having a child a decision. So I'm considering the previous step of adoption.
And Stephen writes, on your account, do some people have a right to more children than others? I was thinking that some people might need more friends than others, for example.
Yeah, well, what I try to express with my new moral limit is that if some people need to have more children, they in some sense may have the right to have them. I could not consider the example of family, but for example, the advocates of the right to one child defend that with one child you can have a family, and therefore the desire to have a family is fulfilled with only one child. But I consider that this is in some sense tricky, because if your desire is to have a large family, this won't be satisfied with only one child. But thank you for your question.
Matthias, I do see your hand. Save your question for afterwards. I'll take notes. You'll be the first to raise your question after the presentations. So thank you very much, Josep, and thank you very much for the questions. We'll move on to the next presentation, which is by Dan Kay and Boris van Meurs from Radboud University in Nijmegen. The title is Direct Duties Towards Future. Oh no, you changed your title. The title is From Climate Guilt to Climate Responsibility.
Yeah, thank you. But can you hear me, by the way?
Yeah, I can hear
Okay,
you. I can see your side.
Yeah, we're working on the paper, so it's really work in progress, which means that the title has been updated since we sent in the abstract. We're working on a paper in which we try to show how we can respond to the non-identity problem. Recent discussions suggest that we could think on the collective level in a response. And we want to follow that, but we want to see how can we differentiate responsibilities if we think on a collective level, so that the responsibility is not charged evenly among all agents, but that differences in power or emissions can be taken aboard. And we'll present some ideas about that. So as people join here for a conference on climate change and ethics, some of you must know the feeling, climate guilt. It's pouring and you're in a hurry, so you take the car. Or you just can't resist stepping on that plane to enjoy a vacation on an exotic island. And then it sets in, was this really necessary? You feel guilty for giving in and neglecting the bad effects of your actions on the climate. But is guilt the adequate response in a case as complex as climate change, where billions of agents dispersed over highly intricate networks all contribute only partly to a problem that arises on a global scale? In our talk, we argue it isn't, but that doesn't absolve you of responsibility. So we argue that we might not be guilty, but that we are still politically responsible to improve our institutions to reduce climate hazards. This is because our actions take place within fossil fuel powered societies, leading to dangerous climate change. And although we are not moral monsters for living our everyday lives, we should take political responsibility to counteract the sometimes unintended harmful consequences of the structures that enable our individual actions. We will use Irish Marion Young's and Michael Sardou's work to explain this. So to be clear, the framework from which we depart is that we oppose guilt and liability on the one hand to responsibility for institutions on the other. What's the difference? Well, for guilt, following Young and Hannah Arendt, we must be able to identify an agent, as on the left picture, who demonstrably did something wrong. In the case of climate change, this could be a steel company willfully polluting above lawful levels, for example. For responsibility, think of the right-hand picture here, we only have to acknowledge that a collective of agents acting normally together create unjust outcomes. So if John Doe drives his car to work, John is not guilty. He might have no alternative, for example. He is, however, still responsible to act because in his actions, he and many with him make use of a fossil fuel infrastructure that, through the effects of emissions, puts others in positions of harm. John takes political responsibility over his actions when he persuades, for example, his local politicians to provide good public transport, so structural change takes place. As Dan will explain now, we will see how Irish Young's social connection model helps us to formulate the difference between guilt and responsibility more clearly.
Yes, thanks, Boris. So can everybody hear me, by the way? Yes, okay, good. Iris Marion Young, a picture of her on the left, she developed a way of looking at the ethics of structural injustice. And she did this mainly in her posthumously published book, Responsibility for Justice. That's on the right. And the model she developed, she calls it the social connection model. And she distinguishes this from a liability model of responsibility by means of 5 main characteristics. The social connection model is not isolating. It takes account of background conditions. It is forward-looking. It grounds in shared responsibility, and it can only be discharged through collective actions. So what does this mean, these 5 characteristics? It means a liability model primarily aims at identifying specific culprits, thereby absolving others. But the social connection model allows us to think cases where everyone involved is part of the problem. And it's important to stress that this does not exclude that some are more part of the problem than others. And it does this by focusing on the background conditions of our acts, and Young calls this structures, rather than these acts themselves. So already before we act, structures have assigned us positions and thereby constrained our possibilities for action. And the social connection model prompts us to acknowledge and act on these structures. And this means that the social connection model is essentially forward-looking, where the liability model is primarily backward-looking. So in other words, a liability model seeks to put the blame on the culprit that acted immorally, but the social connection model rather grounds our responsibility for changing unjust structures. So it does not ask us who did it, but it rather asks what can we all do to make things better. And as I already said, the social connection model allows us to think this responsibility as collectively shared. And taking up this shared collective responsibility therefore asks us to take collective action, for example, the collective direct action, and it calls for solidarity. So of course, this in no way eliminates the necessity of identifying culprits where there are cases of clear liability. However, it does allow us to understand our responsibility in a case as complex as climate change, where the problem is perpetuated not only by a few major polluters, culprits, but also by the structural habits of actions of thousands, if not millions, of actors. And Boris will explain how this translates to our responsibility for future collectives.
Yeah, so in our paper, we try to apply Young's model to discussions about the non-identity problem. And we think that her model is quite suited for this. And as you know, many discussions about climate change are about our responsibility to those who come after us, as the carbon dioxide emitted today can remain in the atmosphere for causing warming for centuries or even millennia to come. And we think that Young's focus on structures and institutions, as well as her argument for these forward-looking kinds of justice, form a bridge between the present and the future in at least 2 ways that we want to explore further in our paper. So first, as indicated on the left picture, this is the political center of the Netherlands in The Hague. Institutions are a legacy to the future. So this means that injustice for today, if we can create fairer positions, these will be inherited by future persons when they take over institutions from us. This was also, so if our institutions, for example, fairly distribute climate harms today by taxing polluters, as Fausto Corvino explained today as well, or by defending natural landscapes and natural parks as carbon sinks, this is a gift we can bestow upon our children and their descendants. Inversely, this also means that we have a task to combat the injustices still inherent or produced by our institutions today, because these will also be inherited by those who come after us. And the second way to think about how institutions and structures already shape the future today is by thinking about, as on the right picture, the different scenarios and different kind of positions that we create for future people. We see that institutions today foreseeably already create unjust future positions that people will take or be put in. In the case of climate change, the latest IPCC report tells us that those dealing with poverty and weak governance structures, which often arise out of global power play and the inheritance of colonialism, are most at risk, and that their situation will be worse for each fraction of actual warming. So this means that if we allow the business of usual to continue of our institutions and the structures that we partake in, that we are creating future positions of misery, even if none of us acts with this goal in mind. So this means, again, not looking for culprits, but trying to take responsibility for our institutions, which means also taking responsibility for the injustices that arise and are produced by the structures and institutions that we are a part of.
So we want to end this presentation with some practical reflections on what an ethics of solidarity could look like. So with regards to climate change, the liability model prompts us to ask questions of guilt and punishment or compensations. And so we do not deny the importance of these questions. So big polluting companies should be held accountable for their actions, and we should try to enforce compensation. But an ethics of solidarity asks us, what can we do to influence existing social structures for the better? And as the name of Young's model, the social connection model, already suggests, the first thing to do is to reject contemporary society's individualism. Since unjust structures are perpetuated through the actions of all, we must join together to work against their injustice. We must engage in conversation with others to show that this dimension of structural injustice is distinguished from specific immoral actions. And we must insist that social structures are not natural facts that are given for all eternity. And second, we must focus on a level that transcends individual actors. So as Boris said, the institutional level is of importance here. Possible actions, so apart from what Natasha already proposed, are of course to vote green, to protest and petition for stricter emission regulations, biodiversity protection. But another example which we can all partake in is to campaign for more sustainable food or uniform options at your workplace. So when the cafeteria at work doesn't offer vegan options, then the employees can hardly be blamed for choosing meat. And this example shows that change is required not in the specific actions of the specific employees, but rather in the possibilities for action in the first place. And this shows what our main point is. So distinct from responsibility taught as liability and guilt, there is a shared collective responsibility for structural justice. And the questions this raises is therefore not, how can I be absolved of this guilt, but rather, what can I do in my position to leave this world a slightly better place for the future? Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your inspiring thoughts. So we do have some time for questions. I mean, that's a great idea to think forward, you know, and to think positive of it also, kind of not that we feel blamed all the time, but that we have a chance to do something good. I mean, this sounds like strange, but I mean, subjectively, this does matter whether we feel bad about being there, you know, consuming all of this, which we really do, and we have to feel, we should feel bad about it, but still, I mean, there's something we can do, and this is a chance of your approach, I would say. So Kathleen, you want to comment or ask something? It's your turn.
I just wondered about whether you could say something more about the collective side of action that you think would be involved. I mean, you mentioned petitioning for more, emission regulations or taking action at your workplace. But as I understand Young, I mean, part of what she's getting at is that individuals have these responsibilities to participate in collective action, but isn't there also a question about I guess, what, initiating collective action and creating the possibility or the environment or the structures for that. Because otherwise we're talking about individuals still qua individuals. I don't know, that's not very well formulated, but just wondered if you had anything more to say about that.
Shall I take this one down?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I see what you mean, but I think that Jung would stress that first, there are always already possibilities to engage with others who are already working on changing these structures, so that in a part you could just join one of these more social groups that are already acting. And I think in some cases, if there isn't such a thing, then indeed it would be at one point it would be an individual who needs to start to get things going. But I think her emphasis would still be on, even if you initiate something, a new chance to change a collective action, that this wouldn't be something that you could do all on your own. And that the question is much more, how can I build a new structure, or how can I change the structure so that indeed people can come together to make these changes that we need, that I cannot make on my own. So I think she would answer maybe along these lines. If that, I hope that answers your question, Kathy.
Yeah, it just seems like her model implies that you have a duty to create such structures for collective action, and not just do something individually that you hope will reflect your appropriate sense of responsibility in the context of what you're contributing to whatever the problem is. So it's not sufficient to, stop eating meat alone, right? But that you have other duties. And in the absence of collective structures to participate in, it seems that you would have a stronger duty to actually create those, right? Is that, would you say that that's implied by her model?
Yeah, exactly. I would say that is implied, and she has 4 parameters of reasoning. I think she calls them, to know who is forced to act in which situation, because we're all implied in many structures that are unfair, and where do we start? So people in power have more responsibility, and one of the things she says there is also people are already involved in structures that they can make use of. For example, religious affiliation, which you could also think of if you're a professor in a university and you have more influence on these structures. This also puts you, as it were, in a position where you are more called upon to make these structural changes. But yeah, what you're saying is correct. It's not just about individual action. Try to create the structures and the collective and the infrastructure for collective action to really make a change.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. It's very helpful.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan and Boris, for this really very dynamic presentation. Oh, there's another question. Let me just, let's do it afterwards. Let's move on to there. Actually, yeah, let's move on, and I'll put you on the list. So our next speaker is Claudio Glaser. He's going to present a paper that was put together by Marc Saint-Jean Calvé from the University of Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, and Claudio Glaser from the Università degli Studi di Trento in Italy. The title is The Problem of Compliance to Rawls' Just Saving Principle.
So this is not the end of my presentation. I just want to start thanking you, Professor Hildet, and all your co-organizers for creating this international and gender balanced moment of intellectual exchange among young and future researchers. It's very appreciated. So this is a co-worked paper, and I start with quoting Daniel Quinn from his book Ishmael, which talks about a gorilla teaching a human how to behave. And Ishmael the gorilla thought for a moment, among the people of your culture, referring to the humans, which want to destroy the world. Which want to destroy it? As far as I know, no one specifically wants to destroy the world. And yet you are destroying it. Each of you contributes daily to the destruction of the world. And this is, in my opinion, what Professor Gardiner framed yesterday as a context of failure. It's more than 20, 30 years that we are trying to agree on, like stopping the increase of greenhouse gases, but we constantly see them raising. And this is a problem mostly for future generations in terms of negative externalities over them, or as formulated more recently as an intergenerational sustainability dilemma. Our actions are taken without thinking about the sustainability towards future generations. And what we try to do in our paper is to analyze this situation of constant failure through the lens of John Rawls's theory of justice. Maybe not many of you know it, but John Rawls didn't devote much attention to environmental issues such as formulated nowadays, but he was among the first ones like to deal with justice between generations, formulating like a just saving principle in the 70s, anticipating decades of debates on climate ethics. He was a sort of visionary, in our opinion, about this topic. Like, he talked about relationship between generations, like nowadays we call it climate change issue, but even before the climate change was even like formulated as a problem. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on his theory. We all know it. We are put behind a veil of ignorance, so we are all equal, and we choose like principles of justice like based on the Maximin criterion. But maybe not many of you know that Rawls has a further specification to his model, which is the person in the agreement have no information as to which generation they belong. So this creates a kind of uncertainty in which place along the timeline we belong. And this is a very powerful model for choosing like an intergenerational principle, because this contractualistic model is like restricted to the existing people. It's not an agreement, even if hypothetical, it's not an agreement between all the generations of the history. So it's like kind of feasible. And the veil of ignorance together, like based on the mutual disinterest and the veil of ignorance, lead to the not tyranny of the present. So in choosing an intergenerational principle, so the outcome is a path over time which treats all generations justly during the whole course of a society's history. This is Rawls' just saving principle formulated like very broadly, not operationalized as much as the different principle that we all know better. Rawls formalizes the just saving principle like in two different ways. First of all, in a theory of justice, he has this extra feature about the people behind the veil of ignorance. They care about their offsprings, while later in political liberalism and in justice as fairness are a statement, he changes his mind, but he doesn't change. He changes like the way of choosing the principle, but he doesn't change the outcome, because the family line assumption, like that we care about our offsprings, our daughters and granddaughters, as the limit of like fighting against the mutual disinterest at the basis of his agreement behind the veil of ignorance. So he reformulated after some critiques the hypothesis at the basis of the intragenerational agreement for intergenerational principle as a full compliance case. So we want a principle that we want all the previous generations had follow it, basically. In this way, we can guarantee, again, a just path over time on terms of distribution of resources. But of course, Rawls had several critiques since the meaning of normative debates on primary goods, basic needs, territorial obligation, etc. But we consider this model, this approach, a good point of departure, since it allows to frame the climate change problem, which is a problem of future generations, kind of, as a problem of the present generation, because it's really restricted to the contemporaries living now. So it's in our interest to choose a just saving principle, or like just a principle for fair division of resources. However, we think that the full compliance assumption at the basis of the reformulation of the just saving principle is the main practical issue, because as I mentioned at the beginning, the prescriptions of all the international environmental agreements that have been like signed so far by nations are almost never fulfilled. I mean, they are fulfilled by single nations, but collectively they fail. And we have also some experimental evidence on how this type of agreement are, I mean, an agreement like between generations doesn't really work. An agreement within the same generation works in order to get like a normative principle, but again, the voluntary compliance is not achieved. So to conclude, Rawls was concerned about climate change even before phrasing the climate change locution. However, he did not sufficiently address, in our opinion, the compliance issue. So with our paper, we try to push the debate beyond the normative concerns. Like, it's 30 years we are discussing on who should, we have seen it also in some presentations before, like with Fausto, I think, which is the right principle, who should pay like for the emissions, like the historical polluters, the current polluters, the future polluters, rich countries, poor countries, or so on and so forth. So we try to indicate that the debate should focus more on practical solutions to guarantee compliance, or as Professor Anna Peterson was mentioning yesterday, but also many other presenters, on to create structures to materialize principles of intergenerational justice, because the main obstacle nowadays is like compliance to intergenerational principle, because it's 30, 40, 50 years that we are debating on normative principles, but if none of them is like respected, they end up being like empty principles, because temperatures keep raising. I tried to be very brief because I know we used a lot of resources to present and to listen to the presentations of the others. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Claudio, for this great presentation. So are there questions? We have, let's say, 2 minutes or so for questions before we move on to the next presentation. There are lots of comments and questions in the chat. I have taken notes and I try to organize around these after our fourth speaker. So are there questions directly to to Claudio's presentation on roles. Peter?
Yes. Yes. I had kind of wanted to ask this question to Dan and Boris much earlier, but I see like everybody is concerned. Everybody, all of us people are concerned with this because, and even Professor made mention of Anna Peterson. She even asked a question yesterday that I wasn't able to answer, and really earlier hours of today I've been thinking about it so strongly. You see, institutional postures, the posture of institutions towards the response to climate actions is kind of influenced by trends, fashion, luxurious lifestyles, and what is happening currently. Now, in terms of trying to come up with an intergenerational principle that is particular for the now, when we look forward to the future, with the same trends that is obtainable currently, will those same trends be obtainable in the future? Because looking at the past, these trends that we are currently facing right now are not the trends that used to be. In the future, if the principles we develop today, would it be fair? Would it be just to apply those same principles in the future without expecting a low level of compliance? Because a lot of other factors have changed. So I think that's basically mine.
Yeah, I understand your point. Like, we cannot have like one principle for the whole history, like holding through the whole history. But indeed, Rose like formula says like there must be like a scheme of principles, or at least a scheme of saving rates, because maybe sometimes we have to say more depending on the actual conditions we find ourselves after we lift the veil of ignorance. So I agree with you, there cannot be like one size fit all principle. That wouldn't work, clearly. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So let's move to the next presentation by Matthias Fritsch from Concordia University. The title is Democratic Institutions, Future People and the Climate Emergency.
Thank you, Professor Hild. Thank you for organizing this really important conference. I'll share my screen and I try to do what I can in the time that is allotted to me. You should be able to see my screen now. I'll turn on slideshow view. So this is a paper in which I'm addressing issues around the way that democratic institutions in particular, have been implicated in the climate crisis. And often democracy gets a bad rap in caring for future generations and the effects of the environmental destabilization more broadly. And what I'm trying to do is in this paper, I'm trying to say, yes, but that shouldn't lead us to abandon democracy. Of course, we should try to rethink it. And maybe there are elements in the heritage of democracy and in the democratic ethos more generally that we can now highlight in response to this crisis and sort of rethink democracy. That's what I'm trying to do here. So I'm not going to go over every slide that I have in detail because the time just doesn't allow that. And this kind of talk, it builds on research that is a little bit longer and has several legs to stand on. And so, but generally that is the goal. I'm trying to suggest that there are resources in the democratic heritage, broadly understood, that we could draw upon today to make democracy less presentist or short-termist, namely that the claim is often in the literature that democracy is primarily concerned with present generations and is not very good at handling problems that exist or occur further in the future. And I'm trying to say basically that, well, there's some elements there in understanding of democracy that we can use to go against that, and in particular is the notion of taking turns. So I'll be talking about taking turns quite a bit. So what are here some of the reasons that have been presented for what I call democratic presentism or democratic short-termism. I'm not going to read them to you. Let me just say that the first four here, I think, are closely related to democracy and its relationship to capitalist markets and a capitalist way of organizing our economic life. The last, I think it's the fifth one there. Yeah, the frequent change of guards required by electoral cycles. I think that one is specific to representative democracies the way we know them today. And that is also the one I want to exploit a little bit more and extend and think about further. But then there are also, of course, reasons that say, well, you know, there are just general human psychology concerns, procrastination, the difficulty of grasping creeping problems, things of that nature. But many of them that I found in the literature, many of these accounts of why democracies are present or tend to be short-termist have to do, I think, with the embedding of democracies, of modern democracies, in a capitalist way of organizing social and economic life. And I think that's important to remember. So there have been in the literature a lot of proposals as to how to do better, how to reform democratic institutions. And I'm also not going to discuss these different ways, compare them and so on. There's not going to be time for that. But you can see here mentioning future people in constitutions, the preamble to the European Constitution, had it ever been ratified, would have done that, for example. The Japanese constitution has been doing it for a long time. And of course, there's the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, that the Great Law of Peace that references famously 7 generations into the future. Which is also why I sometimes think that positioning someone like Rawls as a visionary and first bringing the issue of justice between generations onto the table is a perspective that's rather limited to a certain way of doing philosophy, a certain way of doing political philosophy. If you go further back, especially to pre-modern areas, you will find quite a lot of references to concerns for future generations. But here are some various proposals for how to reform democratic institutions, and I think the one that we've started our conference with, Stephen Gardner's Global Constitutional Convention, I think is one of them, and it's a very exciting one and a very important one. So, but what you might then ask yourself is, okay, so why should we reform democratic institutions? What are the normative resources we could draw upon in order to do so? And when I look at the literature, my impression is that most of the proposals for changing or reforming democratic institutions are what I call extrinsically motivated. That is, the concern for future people is derived not from democratic principles themselves, but typically from other accounts of justice, intergenerational justice. So, for example, egalitarianism or a concern for rights or human rights and so on. And that is what leads one to propose changing democratic ideas, democratic institutions, and so on. And I just think it may be interesting and perhaps better and more useful to think about internal motivations that are so internal to the democratic heritage, because then they are also will be concerned specifically about making sure that democratic institutions work for future people in the context of the environmental crisis. Dan and Boris also pointed to the need to think about the way that we hand on institutions to future people, right? And so my paper fits in with these general concerns. So what's the internal reason I propose? It is taking turns. For that, I need to take a step back and maybe just very briefly highlight some features of work I've done elsewhere. I think that basically there are at least two ways of thinking about sharing something. In this case, we're talking about sharing institutions, but also sharing the environment or sharing the earth with future generations. These two ways are usually not quite appreciated. The difference between them is often, I think, not appreciated in the way it ought to be. When we think about sharing something, then we typically think about it in terms of division. We think about it in terms of sharing by parts, what I call the cake cutting model. So we share a cake by cutting it into pieces. Each one gets a piece, and that's it, right? The sharing is over at that point. But we also are I think all of us are very familiar with sharing by turns, even though it hardly ever shows up in the literature. We're all familiar with that when it comes to sharing a conversation, for example. We take turns with giving our papers, and then one speaks and the others listen. But think about board games. They require taking turns. Think about sharing the swing on the playground and so on. The kids have to take turns going on the swing. So I think we're all, as a result of our socialization and our social life, very familiar with a different kind of sharing, and that is sharing by turns. And here are just some conditions that I think would indicate singly or jointly when sharing by turns may be more appropriate. So number one, for example, when there is something that we want to share that would be destroyed if we cut it up like a cake, then we might consider sharing it by turns. So the bicycle, the mountain hut, something like that. When its use or usefulness is temporary, so you don't need it all the time, then you can share it by turns. So you can share a bicycle with someone or share a car. For generations, I think this is a very useful model, because generations are also occupy the earth and occupy institutions temporarily. So the usefulness in that sense is the use is temporary. When it's owned in common, but it cannot be appropriate or consumed in toto, I think, as is true of a language, a tradition, or the natural environment, there too, I think that the cake cutting model is not the right one. And when typically the item in question to be shared is received from others early in time, but is generally also passed on to others afterward. And I think this applies especially to the natural environment and to the climate, and I've argued this elsewhere. But here I want to say it seems to me applies to political offices, generally to political offices, not just to democratic institutions, but democratic institutions, I think, exhibit or highlight this kind of sharing the most. And here are some reasons to think that democratic institutions exhibit this kind of taking turns approach the most. The first one I'm not going to go into because it involves some metaphysics of time. But one thing that we've learned, I think, from Aristotle is that office rotation, what's typically discussed as office rotation, is particularly germane when you have the problem of reconciling freedom and equality. So freedom means everybody should have access to self-determination and including collective self-determination. But all have that access or have that freedom requirement equally. So you have to reconcile freedom and equality. And what Aristotle in his Politics recommends at that point is that, well, the offices have to be shared then by taking turns with them. So this is a very important notion in Aristotle. This is what I call the pragmatic normative reason. A political reason, I think, that's more modern is that protecting minorities. So democracies typically explain why minorities should consent to the rule of a majority by suggesting that the minority could build up to become the majority at the next turn, for example, in a representative democracy with election cycles at the next election, which is why constitutional guarantees of free assembly, free speech, and so on are so important to democracies, namely that the minority will have the chance to build a political campaign in which they could become the majority next time. So that there's an intrinsic connection there, I think, between democracies and the consent to letting others possibly have a turn after oneself. And when we have this discomfort with a governing party, for example, gerrymandering, stacking up courts, redistricting, and so on, in order to make it difficult or even impossible for another party or another minority to win next time, then that discomfort, I think it expresses something that I call taking turns. Maybe you disagree, but I would be interested in hearing what you have to say about this. There's also a deliberative reason. So in deliberative democracy, and what is emphasized very much is pre-voting a deliberation, and deliberation requires taking turns in speech. There's also what I call a meta-legal reason that's also drawn from Aristotle, and that basically says that if the law applies to all equally, as it does in a democracy, so no one is above the law, then you must always have a kind of taking turn mechanism when it comes to the institutions that apply the law, basically. That is because otherwise you're going to have a conflict of interest. So when it applies to, when the law needs to be applied to someone who is herself someone who applies the law, like a judge, for example, a magistrate of some sort, then that person has to step down, and we need someone else to take on that office. So you have office rotation then. For example, a vice president, where it's interesting that the word vice in vice president, for example, comes from the Latin vices, where per vicem means by turns, right? So there's a connection there. So what does this mean then for future generations, if you accept this so far? It just means that to say yes to democracy is to say yes to potentially letting others have a turn with governing after oneself, right? That's my first premise. The second premise then is this after me, after us, includes future generations, especially the most proximate generation as the next turn taker. And then what follows is the conclusion that affirming democracy is to affirm sharing democratic institutions with future generations. So I think this is the way that I want to rewrite, as it were, reconsider democracies, namely that they have this inherent concern for future generations. And as time is short, I think I'll pretty much leave it at this. My conclusion then also says that taking turns is also particularly appropriate when it comes to sharing the earth with future generations. And so there are suggestions here for what I call an environmentalist or terrestrial embedding of democratic institutions. And coming back then to the main drivers of democratic short-termism, part of my conclusion is that to be a Democrat is to particularly be concerned about future generations in such a way that it is a paramount obligation of present Democrats to counteract the short-termist tendency stemming from the capitalist economy. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Matthias, for your stimulating presentation and for your thoughts. Are there comments? Someone has written something. Yeah, there's a comment from Fausto to Matthias. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I agree. I wanted to ask you, does the model also work in reverse in explaining why we have to protect the posthumous interests of those who had the previous turns?
Wow, I hadn't thought about that. That's a good question. I mean, I do think that the taking turns model generally is good at explaining not just a forward-looking obligation, but one that also looks backward. So I think that it's always important in the context of taking turns to understand not only that one has future turn takers coming after oneself who will take turns with the object with which one is already one is already sharing right now, such as the earth and political institutions, but that one is also inheriting those. So I think that the question of how to be a good ancestor for future generations is enhanced by understanding oneself as a descendant of previous ancestors. And I think that the taking turns model is very good at that, because it suggests that we understand ourselves not as the owners, as it were, of what we are taking turns with, but we only own the turn. So we don't own the earth, we only own the turn with it because there were previous generations and because there are future generations. Similarly with the democratic heritage. So maybe there was something more specific behind it, but I do think it is important to understand oneself as also a descendant of ancestors, and so that one is the inheritor of, one is an heir to the posthumous interests of those now dead. So I do think that is very important.
So before we open up the discussion, and Jelena, I want to say I have taken notes of or I have tried to keep track of the chat. And as far as I understand, there are a number of threads of discussion. There is the thread with Jelena, Matthias, and a few others on this extinction idea on Jelena's presentation she did in the past session. If I see this correctly, there's a thread of discussion between Stephen and Joseph, following up on Joseph's presentation. And then there is the thread between Natasha and Dan and Boris. And if and forgive me if I have forgotten anyone, I have to go through it again. But as Jelena just raised her hand, and as it's Matthias who is here, I just would like to encourage you to kind of be in this conversation, or that part of it has been in the chat. Maybe that's a chance to begin with. And once we are done with this broader topic, we continue with Stephen and Joseph, if that's okay. So it's your turn, Jelena and Matthias.
Sorry, Elizabeth, I'm not sure I understood which thread we should follow, because I have a question for Matthias.
You are free to ask whatever you want.
Oh, okay.
I was thinking, because you had a lot of messages, isn't it, with Matthias, and between you, Matthias, and some others. I think also Andrew joined you because on this extinction idea and on your and I wanted to give all of you a chance to basically talk about this if you wanted to. That's, I'm not.
Yes, let's see where our conversation will take us. Thank you, Matthias, for your presentation. I thought it's very thought-provoking, and I noted down lots of things, but I will ask two things. So the first one is, yeah, I fully agree with this point of looking for, let's say, democratic principles in order to transform democratic institutions from within. And I just wonder whether you have considered the all affected principle, because it seems to me that it very much applies to future generations. And if we would think, yeah, one can even make a parallel. You probably know about the debates about global demos, boundary problem, and so on. So one may say that if we apply all affected principle to future generations, maybe we are facing like temporal boundary problems. So like a temporal extension of demos. So that would be very interesting to explore. And the other question is maybe less theoretical. It seems to me that you're focusing mostly on representative institutions of democracy, like directly representative, but I wonder whether you are considering the role of courts, because they can, under some conditions, take interests of future generations into account somewhat. They don't do it so well, but yeah, I wouldn't neglect their role either. Thank you.
Yeah, these are excellent points. Role of courts, I don't have that much to say other than I think I think you're a political scientist, right? I think political scientists are diagnosing a general shift away from the executive branch of elected governments towards the courts. And many argue that this is part of fast-paced politics. So it's part of acceleration. And part of the problem with acceleration is the problem that the neglect of future generations is concerned. So that it what I'm trying to say is that part of my analysis of the various drivers of short-termism is social acceleration. And part of social acceleration is this pushing of what normally would be legislative, would be decisions for the legislative branch, policy making, climate policy, and so on, is pushed towards the courts. And so we see all these claims. I mean, you discussed them, and you discussed one of the cases that I don't know, but it sounds very fascinating, and I'd love to know more concerning the European Court of Human Rights, where the courts are now asked to step in for government failures, where government are not enacting climate policy. So we had some famous cases in the Netherlands. We had the famous case of the Constitutional Court in Germany ruling on the claim on the part of Fridays for Future and others. In the US, there's a case in California, I believe. And so there are these interesting cases, but they are part, and they're good. I mean, we have to do whatever we can, but I think they're part of a general trend that is more problematic. And that's what you find in the work of Hartmut Rosa, William Scheuermann, political theorists like this, who argue that this needs to be seen as part of social acceleration. And social acceleration is connected to neglect for future generations. I know I'm going very quickly. The all-effective principle is, in fact, what I think is the only contender I've seen in the literature seeking to draw from something internal to the democratic heritage and make it relevant to future generations. And I just actually, this is always problematic to say, right? But I just published a paper on Habermas and future generations and why discourse ethics has all these problems considering future generations. And I make a proposal for reconsidering the all-effective principle. I think it needs to be reconsidered and not just directly applied, because otherwise you lose some of the very positive features of discourse ethics. So the positive features are that you actually demand that you have to talk to those who are most affected by your decisions, the most vulnerable. You have to actually talk to them and listen to them, right? But when you are now extending the all-effective principle to future generations, then you have to render consent hypothetical. You have to say something like, oh, they would consent to that. And I don't think that's bad, but if you read the all-effective principle just in this way, then you're losing some of the real virtues of discourse ethics in the Habermasian or the Appelian form, or as it is extended in deliberative democracy. And I don't want to lose those advantages. So I have a proposal as to how to rethink the all-effective principle in line actually with something that I call the chain model or the taking turns model of generations, the way that generations should think of themselves. And in Habermas that works because discourse ethics is embedded in the life world, and the life world requires that you be concerned about future deliberators. So you have to be concerned about the capacities that future people will have in order to participate in deliberative democracy. So I can send you that paper if you want. I think, Elizabeth, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm muted. I just realized it. Okay, so let's move on to Stephen and Joseph. Stephen, you had a question and Joseph responded, isn't it? Maybe you want to raise this.
Oh, I'm not sure that I that I do, unless he wants to say more. I really liked your paper, Joseph, and I think it has lots of good implications. So I was just pressing you to elaborate a little bit more on the implications.
That's good.
Thank you very much. Yeah, but I also saw that there was maybe a comment by Matthias that I did not answer before because I don't have an answer yet, but maybe it is obviously that we should consider other perspective while considering when having children, but I also think that there could be different ethical tests to pass before having children, and maybe there should pass first the idea if it's important for the parents' conception of a good life, and if yes, then they should maybe consider other ethical implications concerning their children. I don't think it's incompatible. Thank you very much.
And I want to read Andrew's point. He writes, children alive today can expect a lifespan of, say, 70 years, taking them to 2090. At present rate, 1.5 degree to 2 degrees will be passed around 2050, and 3 degrees is expected around 2100. Are we missing the point by our focus on future generations? He asks, maybe that.
I mean, if this is addressed to me, could I just briefly say it depends on how you define future generations. There are many different definitions. Steve Gardner, in his wonderful book, The Perfect Moral Storm, discusses various definitions, and so do others. And you need not define future generations in such a way that it's only all those living after the currently living, right, are dead. So it's not. You need not define it that way, and I don't. I define it in such a way that you have overlapping generations, and so they are included. So when I'm concerned about future generations, then I'm very much concerned about those who are already alive today, just younger than I am. So for me, they are included in future generations, the way I define it. I could say more what kind of implications that has, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation here.
Yeah, so it's
thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you. So now it's Natasha and Dan and Boris. You had some exchange. Maybe you want to talk about it so that we all are aware of what this is about. Natasha?
Yes, actually, I'm trying to scroll up. Basically, I was just asking them about, oh, that's not the one. Basically just asking them if they could elaborate a little bit more, if they had any material on the relationship between environmental degradation, the productive forces, its present managers, and the responsibility of collective action to change these relationships. And I believe they said that it's an area of interest, but they don't have anything directly just yet. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so on this topic specifically, we do not have any material yet, but I mean, it's we try to make a kind of general point, and this seems like a very interesting, like a practical fill-in of this general point. So yeah, unfortunately, I cannot elaborate on this now yet, but I'm very eager to learn about this. But I got your email address, and I will definitely send you an email. So thanks again for that.
Yeah, great. So we have time for one more question. Peter,
Yes.
ask your question or make your comment.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My question is directed to Matthias. Your presentation was awesome. It's great. My thoughts, of which I have a question for you, is the fact that in a democratic government enshrined on the principle of liberalism, where people have the right to express how they want to behave, but to some certain extent governed by regulations, rules, laws. Is it possible that because I think somebody was presenting yesterday, said something about iron government, where government various government institutions need to be more stringent, need to be more fixed, apply more force to control climate actions, so that such that people obey, people yield to them, and rather not just choose to which action plan, which principle you want to believe, you want to accept, or rather, is there any way for force to compel people to behave and put certain practices in place, especially when it comes to major corporations, institutions, in terms of companies, regulate them and force them to behave in a certain way. And when you bring in that the concept of force in a democratic system of government, also bringing about something that is way different from a democratic system of government. I don't know if you get my question, please.
Yeah, I think I do. I mean, when it comes to climate policy, there's also the question of how to rein in what Sasha in his presentation earlier today called climate aggressors, especially big companies. And part of the problem that we have is that we now have democratic nation state governments located in a globalized economy where these nation states are themselves competing for attracting capital and often then bowing to the demands of capital. And they are threatened with capital flight, with the threat of disinvestment and so on. So we have massive problems that stem from a globalized capitalist economy that of course is globalized in part because of the previous actions of governments that are often called neoliberal. So neoliberal deregulation of markets and so on. I think Natasha addressed this a little bit earlier in the talk as well. So yes, that is a big problem. And here I would again refer to maybe for the sake of brevity to Steve's analysis of the perfect mall storm, which on the one hand has that intergenerational component that we're talking about here, which requires that we have institutions that are capable of enforcing decisions over a long temporal span. But we also have the global storm. And there we have the problem of cooperation among these actors that are themselves in competition with one another and are caught in a collective action problem on a spatial scale, not just on a temporal scale, where, as Steve showed yesterday, the problem gets even worse in a certain way. So yes, and I don't have my talk wasn't proposing a solution to that, to the question of enforcement and very real power relations that we're facing today. What I wanted to do instead was to say, well, we shouldn't, when it comes to this enforcement problem, for example, we shouldn't think of abandoning democracy. We shouldn't go for an economic dictatorship as is sometimes proposed in the literature. Yes. What we should do instead is that we should try to rethink the democratic heritage and see what kind of resources does it have in this under the contemporary pressures that we're feeling in order to respond better to the needs of future generations, including overlapping future generations. This is what I was trying to do.
Thank you very much. I love the part you said that rethink the democratic heritage is awesome, because most times there's a tendency to want to bring about a dictative kind of government where you're forcing people too excessively. Whether you like it or not, people sometimes force brings about a retaliative reason not to comply, because people want to express as much freedom as they choose to. So thank you very much.
Well, I mean, there's also the very real threat of what some people have started calling fossil fascism, that governments become increasingly subject to pressures from the far right, right, and as a result of the climate crisis. So you find this in a recent book by Andreas Malm and his collaborators. The subtitle is "The Dangers of Fossil Fascism." So I think that is a very real concern, because the fossil fuel world that we live in, the fossil fuel driven world that we live in, was built for a particular group of people, right? It benefits particular groups of people, especially North American and European white people, and so they stand to lose a lot. And when we enact appropriate climate policies, and they may feel that they need to defend, on the one hand, that fossil fuel infrastructure, and at the same time something that goes under the heading of white supremacy. So there's a kind of, you see sometimes politically, you see a kind of connection there that is quite worrisome. For some time, Trump was the embodiment of that. Donald Trump, the previous US president, was the embodiment of this climate denialism on the one hand, and lots of gestures towards white supremacy on the other. So you have that problem too. So it's very important to defend democracy against these threats, I think, and that's part of the political motivation, the circumstantial motivation for me as well. So drawing upon the resources of democracy in order to strengthen it in the face of future threats that have to do with the climate crisis.
Yeah, that's an important point, strengthen the democracies. I mean, one of my questions would also have been what were the totalitarian rule of that? I mean, you have talked about this, and yeah, you're right. So we are at the end now of our conference. Thank you very much, all of you, for your fantastic presentations and for your great comments and questions. I think we had amazing discussions, and you raised such a lot of facets and layers of this topic. This is really amazing, and I absolutely learned a lot, and there's a lot to think about for all of us. I think this is obvious. What we will do, we recorded the presentations, and we will upload them to our Ethics Center homepage, and you can all access them. It's our intention to continue with this initiative and to build a network of people interested in climate change and ethics. Maybe we could collect the papers of the presentations, maybe publish them somewhere. I'm not sure whether you are interested in something like this, or we could think about collaborating somehow on a project. I would be curious to hear your feedback on this, whether you would be interested in continuing somehow. Anyway, what we are going to do is to have 2 more webinars, because as mentioned in the beginning, we got such a lot of great abstracts that we thought we should give people a chance to talk about their topics. We will have one on the role of governments and societal actors in mitigating climate change, and one on risk, reflecting on risk and its implications. They are both on Mondays at 11 a.m. Central Time, I think April 25th and April 11. Yeah, so I would absolutely love to thank you for having been there, having participated in discussions. This was really amazing to see all of your work and what you are doing and how this connects. Actually, I mean, how I'm sure you are aware of this, how towards the end you connected and had your own threads. I mean, this was amazing. This was absolutely fantastic.